Fort Bragg had seen many things: celebrations, departures, injuries, promotions, and even failures that no one talked about again. But it rarely saw humiliation brewing in real time. That morning the air felt different. Not because of weather, not because of training, but because of people. Nearly 900 soldiers had been called for what was officially labeled as a joint performance evaluation demonstration. No one believed that version. Soldiers don't gather in this number for something routine. Something was about to happen. And deep down, everyone knew it. At the center of the field stood Sergeant Ava Collins. She wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy. And she didn't try to prove anything to anyone. Her uniform was clean, perfectly fitted, and practical. No unnecessary display of ego. No exaggerated posture. Just discipline made visible. Ava was the type of soldier people underestimated twice. Once when they met her, and once when it was already too late. But across the field, that calm was being tested. Because someone had decided to turn this into a challenge. Staff Sergeant Derek Mason. He was built differently than most soldiers, tall, broad, physically imposing. But what made him noticeable wasn't his strength. It was his attitude. Mason had returned from overseas deployment 6 months ago. In that time, his reputation had grown, but not entirely in the way leadership liked. He was skilled, yes. Experienced, yes. But controlled, no. Respectful, not always. And today, he had chosen the worst possible stage for his ego. He stood slightly ahead of formation, packing like the field belonged to him. His voice carried across the open ground. "She's been training recruits on theory and simulations," Mason said, gesturing toward Ava without even looking at her fully. "But let's be honest, real combat doesn't follow training manuals." A few soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Because now it wasn't just commentary. It was personal. Ava didn't respond. Not yet. Her eyes stayed forward, calm, focused, but not distant. She was listening, measuring, waiting. Mason continued, feeding off attention. "I've been in situations where hesitation gets people killed," he said. "And I'm telling you now, some instructors shouldn't be instructors." That's when the silence changed. It wasn't quiet anymore. It was heavy. Because now he had crossed from opinion into disrespect. A lieutenant nearby stepped forward slightly, sensing the shift. "Staff Sergeant Mason," he warned, "watch your tone." But Mason didn't stop. In fact, he smiled slightly. That was the problem with confidence that turns into ego. It doesn't recognize danger even when it's standing right in front of it. "I'm not disrespecting anyone," Mason said loudly, now turning slightly toward Ava. "I'm just saying, some people look better on paper than in reality." That was it. The final line. Every soldier felt it at once, the moment something becomes irreversible. Ava finally moved. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just one step forward. And somehow, that single step changed the temperature of the entire field. She looked at Mason directly now. Not angry. Not offended. Just aware. "You've been talking for 3 minutes," she said calmly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it reached everyone. "And you haven't said anything new." A few soldiers almost reacted, some subtle expressions, a suppressed breath of amusement. Mason's smirk faded slightly. Ava continued. "If experience made someone right," she said, "then every mistake would already be learned." That line landed differently. Not as a comeback, but as a warning. Mason tilted his head slightly, studying her now for the first time properly. "You think you can analyze me?" he asked. Ava didn't blink. "I don't need to." That was when the tension snapped into something else. Because now it wasn't just a disagreement. It was a challenge that didn't need words anymore. The commanding officer, Colonel Harris, stepped forward immediately. He had seen this pattern before. Two strong personalities, one public setting, and an audience too large for mistakes. "This stops now," Harris said firmly. "Both of you step forward." The entire formation straightened. Something official was happening now. Harris looked between them. "This will be resolved through controlled combat evaluation," he announced. "No weapons, no interference, standard rules." A ripple moved through the soldiers. Controlled combat evaluation wasn't rare. But it wasn't common either. And it was never emotional. At least not supposed to be. Mason nodded immediately. Almost too quickly. "I'm fine with that," he said. Then he looked at Ava. Ava didn't respond immediately. She adjusted her gloves slightly. A small, precise motion. Not hesitation. Preparation. Finally she spoke. "I accept." No emotion. No hesitation. Just certainty. And that silence afterward. It felt heavier than the argument that came before it. The walk to the ring. The training ring was set up quickly. Too quickly. That was another sign this wasn't ordinary. A circle of marked ground, surrounded by barriers and soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. No noise now. Even those who had been joking earlier were quiet. Because now it was real. Mason walked in first. Confident. Loose shoulders. A slight bounce in his step. He was performing even before the fight started. He wanted the crowd to see him a certain way. Strong. Controlled. Superior. Ava entered second. No performance. No theatrics. Just presence. And strangely, that bothered Mason more than anything else. Because people who don't try to intimidate usually don't need to. The instructor overseeing the match stepped forward. "Rules are simple," he said. "First incapacitation or submission ends the match. No excessive force. No weapons, understood?" Both nodded. Mason rolled his neck. Ava stood still. The instructor stepped back. There was a moment before the whistle. That moment always feels longer than it should. Soldiers stopped breathing properly. Even distant noise seemed to fade. And then, whistle. The first move. Mason moved instantly. No hesitation. No testing. He went straight in. Fast forward pressure. Heavy right strike designed to overwhelm immediately. It was the kind of opening that worked on recruits, not on experienced opponents. Ava didn't retreat. She shifted half a step sideways. That's all. The strike passed through empty space. A few soldiers reacted instinctively. Because it was clean. Too clean. Mason didn't slow down. Second attack immediately. Left hook. Aimed higher. Ava raised her arm, not to block directly but to redirect. The impact didn't land clean. It slid. Controlled deflection. Mason's expression changed slightly. Not concern yet. But adjustment. He increased speed. "Stop moving around," he snapped. Ava finally moved forward. Not backward. Forward. That alone changed the rhythm. She entered his space just as he committed to another strike. And for the first time, he hesitated. Just a fraction. But enough. His balance shifted slightly off. Ava didn't strike. She didn't need to. She simply tapped his shoulder as he passed. And Mason stumbled forward half a step. Not a fall. Not damage. just loss of control. And in combat, control is everything. A few soldiers leaned forward. Because that wasn't luck. That was timing. Mason turned quickly now, his expression sharper. "This is what you do," he said. "You avoid." Ava looked at him calmly. "I observe," she replied. And that was worse, because it meant she was already learning. The first crack in confidence. Mason attacked again. Harder this time. Less clean. More forceful. He wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to dominate. That shift is dangerous, because dominance blinds precision. Ava waited. And waited. And then she moved. One step inside his strike line. Perfect timing. His arm passed slightly off target. And Ava used that opening. A quick, controlled motion redirected his momentum. Mason's feet shifted awkwardly. And for the first time, he had to recover. He stepped back. Just one step. But the crowd saw it. Because retreats are louder than attacks in silence. A faint murmur spread through the soldiers. Mason heard it too. His jaw tightened. And something inside him changed. Not skill. Not technique. Ego. End of part 1. Hook. Mason stopped smiling. Ava didn't change expression at all. But now the field felt different. Because one man had just realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't going to be the fight he expected. And the 900 soldiers watching had started to understand it too. The silence after the first exchange didn't last long. But it changed everything. Not because something dramatic had happened, but because something small had. And in combat training, small things are what decide everything. The crowd starts watching differently. Around the ring, 900 soldiers stood in formation like silence, but their focus had sharpened. At first, they were here for entertainment. Now they were here for analysis. Because what they just saw didn't match expectations. Staff Sergeant Mason had entered the ring like a storm, fast, confident, aggressive. Sergeant Ava Collins had responded like something else entirely. Not a wall. Not a counterforce. But a system. A system that didn't react emotionally. It adjusted. A soldier near the back whispered quietly. She didn't even try to hit him. Another answered. She didn't need to. That line hung in the air. Because it sounded like confidence. Or warning. Mason realizes something is wrong. Inside the ring, Mason rolled his shoulders again, trying to reset his mindset. He wasn't used to this feeling. Not pain. Not injury. Something worse. Uncertainty. He had fought stronger opponents before. He had been in real combat zones. He had survived pressure situations where hesitation meant consequences. But this was different. Because nothing he was doing was landing cleanly. And worse, she wasn't reacting like a normal opponent. She was reading him. He narrowed his eyes. "You're analyzing angles," he muttered. Ava didn't answer immediately. She just shifted her stance slightly. Balanced. Calm. Centered. Then she replied softly. "I don't need angles to see patterns." That sentence hit him more than expected. Because patterns meant predictability. And predictability meant he was already being understood. The second exchange begins. Mason didn't wait for mental pressure to build further. He moved. This time faster. More controlled. Less wild aggression, more trained pressure. He closed distance quickly, aiming to force a clinch, a space where strength and body control mattered more than movement. Ava didn't retreat. She stepped slightly to the side again. Not away. Just offline. Mason's arm brushed past her shoulder. He tried to adjust mid-motion. Too slow. Ava's hand made contact, not striking, not grabbing aggressively, but guiding his movement off balance. Mason stumbled half a step. Not a fall, but a correction forced by someone else. The crowd reacted again. This time louder. Not cheers. Not boos. Just recognition. Because now it was clear. This wasn't random anymore. The first emotional crack. Mason exhaled sharply. His patience was thinning. "You're just dodging," he said louder now. "That's all you're doing." Ava finally looked directly at him again. And this time, there was something different in her expression. Not anger. Not irritation. Just clarity. "If I was only dodging," she said, "you wouldn't be asking questions." That hit deeper than expected. Because it wasn't a comeback. It was a reflection. And reflection is dangerous in combat. Mason's jaw tightened. He stepped forward again. But this time, his movement wasn't smooth. It had weight, emotion, frustration starting to leak into skill. And that is the first sign of breaking form. Leadership notices the shift. On the edge of the training field, Colonel Harris stood with two other officers. His eyes were fixed on the ring now. Not casually. Closely. One of the officers spoke quietly. "Sir, Mason is losing rhythm." Harris didn't respond immediately. He had seen many fights like this. Strong soldier. Confident soldier. Then something shifts. And suddenly confidence becomes liability. Finally Harris said, "It's not rhythm he's losing." A pause. Then, "It's control." Mason escalates. Back in the ring, Mason changed tactics again. This time he stopped trying to outskill her. He decided to overwhelm. He rushed forward with heavier pressure, trying to trap Ava against movement boundaries. This was his comfort zone. Close combat. Force-based dominance. He lunged in. Ava waited. Still calm. Still steady. Mason closed distance. And for a brief moment, he almost had her cornered. His hand reached forward. Contact. He grabbed her arm. Finally, a direct control point. A small surge of confidence returned instantly. "I got you," he said under his breath. But Ava didn't panic. She didn't resist forcefully. She adjusted. A slight shift in wrist angle. A small pivot in stance. And suddenly, Mason's grip wasn't controlling her anymore. It was guiding his own imbalance. Ava rotated her body slightly, using his grip as leverage. And Mason's posture collapsed forward. Not violently. Not dramatically. But enough. Enough for control to break. He stumbled again. And this time, he had to take 2 steps back to recover. The crowd gasped. Because this was no longer a close match. This was becoming something else entirely. The first time he feels it. Mason stopped for half a second. Chest rising. Breathing deeper now. Not from exhaustion. From frustration. His eyes locked onto Ava. And for the first time, something crossed his expression that wasn't confidence. It was doubt. "What are you?" he muttered. Ava tilted her head slightly. A quiet pause. Then, "A soldier." That answer wasn't dramatic, but it landed heavily, because it implied something deeper. That everything he was experiencing wasn't special. It was standard. Controlled, trained, repeated. The crowd begins to shift emotionally. Among the 900 soldiers, something subtle was happening. At first, many were leaning toward Mason. He was loud, familiar, aggressive. But now, that support was thinning. Because people can recognize control, and they can recognize panic disguised as aggression. One soldier whispered, "He's forcing everything now." Another replied, "And she's not forcing anything." That contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Mason's ego starts fighting his skill. Mason took a deep breath. He tried to reset again. But now it wasn't physical. It was mental. He told himself, "She's just good at defense. She's just timing. She'll slip eventually." That internal dialogue is what keeps ego alive. But ego always demands proof. And so he rushed again. Harder, faster, less control, more emotion. He attempted a sweeping strike, followed by forward pressure. A combination meant to overwhelm timing itself. Ava didn't move backward. She stepped in again. Perfect timing. And for a fraction of a second, Mason realized something terrifying. She was not reacting to him. She was already positioned for him. Before he even completed the motion. The first real break. His strike missed cleanly. His balance shifted forward too far. And Ava used that exact moment. A controlled redirection. A pivot. A subtle shift in his center of gravity. And Mason stumbled forward harder this time. He didn't fall, but he had to catch himself with visible effort. And that moment, that visible effort, was what changed the atmosphere completely. Because now everyone saw it. Not a lucky moment, not a mistake, but a pattern breaking. The loudest silence yet spread across the field. Even Mason didn't speak immediately. He just stood there, breathing heavier, eyes sharper. Something inside him had cracked. Not broken, but exposed. And Ava, still calm, still steady, still watching, like she already knew what came next. The air above Fort Bragg felt heavier now. Not because of heat, not because of weather, but because of expectation turning into pressure. What had started as a public challenge had now become something far more dangerous. A slow unraveling of pride in real time. And 900 soldiers were no longer watching a match. They were watching a breakdown begin. Mason tries to reset, but something is already gone. Staff Sergeant Derek Mason stood in the ring, chest rising and falling deeper now. He rolled his shoulders again, adjusted his stance again, tried to reset his breathing again. But none of it worked the way it was supposed to. Because reset only works when control is still intact. And control was already slipping. He stared at Sergeant Ava Collins. Still calm, still steady, still standing like she hadn't even changed temperature since the fight began. That bothered him more than anything else. Because exhaustion is expected. But calm under pressure feels unnatural when you are the one losing control. Mason exhaled sharply. "You're not even fighting," he said loudly. Ava tilted her head slightly. "I am," she replied. "You just haven't adapted yet." That line landed differently. Not like an insult, like a diagnosis. And that's what made it worse. The shift into aggression. Something inside Mason changed. Not improvement. Not strategy. Frustration. He stepped forward faster now. No longer trying to outthink. Now trying to overpower. His movement became heavier. less precise, more force-driven. The kind of fighting that comes when the mind stops planning and starts reacting emotionally. He charged in again. A fast strike combination. Left, right, forward pressure. This time, the crowd leaned forward instantly. Because aggression always looks like momentum. At first, but Ava didn't retreat. She waited until the exact moment his balance committed. Then, she moved. Not away. Not back. Just slightly offline. His first strike missed. His second passed close. His forward motion carried him too far. And that was enough. Ava stepped in. A controlled pivot. A redirection of his forward energy. And Mason's body tilted forward slightly off-center again. Not dramatic. Not loud. But visible. And visibility is what changes perception. The crowd starts turning. Among the 900 soldiers, the shift became noticeable now. At first it was curiosity, then surprise, then silence turning into analysis. One soldier near the back whispered, "He's overcommitting." Another responded quietly, "No, she's letting him overcommit." That distinction mattered, because one implies mistake, the other implies control, and control is far more intimidating. Mason forces a grapple, a dangerous decision. Mason changed tactics again. Now he stopped striking at distance. He closed in aggressively, trying to bring the fight into close quarters, where brute strength could dominate, where space disappears, where instinct takes over. He lunged forward and reached for Ava's upper body. This time, contact was immediate. His hand locked onto her arm. Then his other hand moved in. A full grapple attempt. The crowd reacted instantly, because grappling changes everything. It removes space. It removes timing advantage. It becomes physical dominance. Mason exhaled sharply. "Got you now," he muttered. For a moment, it looked like he had finally shifted the fight. Ava was within reach. Contained. Controlled. Or so it seemed. The moment everything reverses. Ava didn't resist force with force. She adjusted. A small shift in stance. A controlled drop in center of gravity. Her body rotated slightly under his grip. And suddenly, Mason's control point wasn't stable anymore. It was compromised. His grip tightened instinctively. But tightening grip doesn't equal control. It often means panic disguised as effort. Ava used that exact moment. She rotated through his pressure line, redirected his arm angle, shifted his balance forward, and Mason's stance broke. Not completely, but enough. His feet adjusted awkwardly to recover, and that recovery cost him position. Ava stepped out of the grip cleanly, and in that transition, Mason realized something uncomfortable. He hadn't controlled her even when he had contact. He had only held onto instability. The first real emotional break. Mason stepped back quickly, now breathing harder, sweat forming at his temples. His jaw tightened. "This isn't real combat," he snapped suddenly. "This is training tricks." Ava looked at him, calm, unshaken, and said softly, "All combat is patterns under pressure." That sentence hit deeper than expected, because it implied something he didn't want to accept. He wasn't losing to randomness. He was losing to structure. Leadership starts to intervene emotionally. Colonel Harris stepped forward slightly at the edge of the field. His expression had changed now. Not concern. Evaluation. One of the officers beside him spoke quietly. "Sir, should we stop this?" Harris didn't answer immediately, because stopping it now would mean admitting something had gone wrong. And commanders don't like reacting to ego clashes. They like control. Finally, Harris said, "Not yet." A pause. Then, "I want to see how far he can recover." That decision would matter more than anyone realized. Mason pushes one more time. Back in the ring, Mason took a deep breath. This time, something had changed in him. The confidence was gone. The performance was gone. What remained was something unstable. He rushed again. But now it wasn't clean aggression. It was desperate aggression. The kind that comes when pride refuses to accept reality. He closed distance fast. A straightforward strike attempt followed by a grab. Ava watched him approach. Still, focused, and at the last moment, she moved. Not away. Not back. Into the angle he didn't expect. His strike passed empty space. His grab missed again. And his body moved forward too far once more. That pattern was becoming dangerous. Because repeated imbalance is not coincidence. It is prediction. The first clean breakdown moment. Ava stepped in slightly. A controlled pivot. A redirection of his forward momentum. And this time, Mason couldn't recover cleanly. His foot slipped half a step. His posture broke visibly. Not a fall, but a loss of structure. And in combat training, structure is everything. A sharp silence spread through the crowd, because now it was undeniable. He wasn't just being countered. He was being managed. Mason steadied himself quickly, but something had shifted in his expression now. Not anger, not confidence, something quieter. Confusion starting to creep in. The psychological collapse begins. Mason exhaled deeply. "You're reading me," he muttered. Ava responded without hesitation. "I'm not reading you," she said. "You're repeating yourself." That line hit differently. Because repetition means predictability. And predictability means vulnerability. Mason's breathing became heavier. His movements slightly less precise. His decision-making slower. Not because of physical fatigue, but because of mental pressure building under realization. He had entered the fight thinking experience was enough. But experience without adaptation becomes limitation. And limitation becomes exposure. The crowd fully shifts now. Among the 900 soldiers, the mood changed completely. This was no longer debate. No longer speculation. It was observation of collapsed structure. One soldier whispered, "He's not adjusting anymore." Another responded, "He can't." That second line carried weight. Because inability is worse than failure. Mason tries one last aggressive surge. Mason stopped thinking. Stopped packing. Stopped adjusting. He charged forward again. This time with full force. A final attempt to overwhelm through intensity alone. It was reckless. Uncontrolled. Emotion-driven. Ava watched him approach. Still calm. Still centered. And at the exact moment he committed fully. She moved. Not away. Not back. Just slightly off his center line. His attack passed through empty space again. And his balance broke completely for the first time. He stumbled forward hard. Caught himself late. Barely stable. And the field fell into absolute silence. Because now, everyone understood what was happening. Not a match. Not a challenge. but a controlled dismantling of momentum. End of Part 3. Hook. Mason stood in the ring, breathing heavier than before. His confidence was gone. His rhythm was gone. And for the first time, he wasn't thinking about winning. He was thinking about surviving his own mistakes. And Ava, still calm, still steady, still watching, like the fight had already ended. He just hadn't realized it yet. The silence over Fort Bragg had changed again. Earlier it was anticipation. Then it became curiosity. Then analysis. Now it was something else entirely. It was understanding. Because 900 soldiers weren't just watching a fight anymore. They were watching a conclusion slowly reveal itself. And Staff Sergeant Mason could feel it too. Even if he didn't want to admit it. Mason stands in a different reality now. Mason stood in the center of the ring, chest rising and falling harder than before. His uniform clung slightly tighter from sweat. His breathing was uneven now, not because of exhaustion alone, but because his rhythm was gone. And without rhythm, everything feels heavier. He looked at Ava, still calm, still composed, still standing like nothing in the last few minutes had even touched her stability. That difference was no longer subtle. It was obvious. And that was the problem. Because soldiers don't fear strength alone. They fear control they cannot understand. Mason exhaled sharply. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. Ava didn't respond immediately. She just adjusted her stance slightly. Small movement. Perfect balance. Then she spoke. "It does," she said quietly. "You just stopped seeing it early." That sentence landed like pressure instead of sound. Because it implied something worse than defeat. It implied delay. The final push begins. Mason clenched his jaw. Something inside him refused to accept what was happening. Not skill. Not logic. Ego. And ego in pressure situations doesn't surrender. It escalates. He stepped forward again. But this time, there was no strategy left in his movement. Only force. Only urgency. Only the need to reverse what was already slipping away. He charged. Hard. Vast. A final aggressive attempt. The crowd reacted instantly. Because everyone recognized the shift. This was no longer controlled combat. This was desperation in motion. Mason threw a straightforward strike. Then another. Then stepped in to close distance completely. Ava waited until the last possible moment. Still. Focused. Then. She moved. Not away. Not backward. Just slightly off the line of attack. His strike passed through empty space again. But this time, his balance didn't recover. His forward momentum carried him too far. And for the first time in the entire match, Mason couldn't correct himself in time. The collapse moment. Ava stepped in. A precise, controlled adjustment. Not force. Not aggression. Just timing. And Mason's stance broke completely. His feet shifted unevenly. His upper body tilted forward. He tried to recover. But the recovery came too late. He dropped to one knee. Not violently. Not dramatically. But unmistakably. A controlled breakdown of structure. The ring went completely silent. Not a single voice. Not a single movement. 900 soldiers didn't react immediately. Because they needed a moment to confirm what they just saw. Mason remained on one knee for a second longer than necessary. His breathing heavy. His head slightly lowered. And for the first time, He didn't look angry. He looked still, like something inside him had finally stopped resisting. Ava stood in front of him, calm, unchanged, not celebrating, not emotional, just present. The whistle that ended everything. The instructor stepped forward slowly. His voice broke the silence. Match over. The words were simple, but they carried finality. Mason slowly pushed himself back to standing. Not quickly, not confidently, just slowly, like someone trying to reconnect with reality. He didn't look at Ava immediately, because sometimes looking at the source of defeat makes acceptance harder. Ava stepped back slightly. Respectful distance. No arrogance. No gesture of victory. Just completion. The crowd reaction finally breaks. At first, silence. Then a small shift of movement among the soldiers. Then whispers. Then realization spreading through formation like a wave. Not excitement. Not humiliation. But recognition. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't just a fight. It was structure versus instability. Control versus emotion. Precision versus ego. One soldier near the front finally spoke quietly. She didn't overpower him. Another answered. She outlasted his mistakes. That distinction mattered. Because strength wins fights, but control ends them. Mason's internal collapse. Mason stood still in the ring. Hands lowered. Breathing slower now. But not calm. Empty. He replayed everything in his mind. Every exchange. Every failed adjustment. Every moment he thought he had control. And realized he didn't. His jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger, but in realization. He looked at Ava finally. And what he saw didn't help his pride. She wasn't superior in expression. She wasn't mocking. She wasn't emotional at all. That was worse. Because it meant she hadn't even needed emotional energy to win. She had simply executed. Mason spoke quietly. I thought I had you, he admitted. Ava responded without hesitation. You had confidence, she said, not control. That difference hit harder than the fight itself. Command response. Colonel Harris stepped forward fully now. The formation straightened instinctively. Harris looked at Mason first, then at Ava. His expression was controlled, but thoughtful. You both understand what just happened, he said. No one answered, because it wasn't a question. He continued. This was not about strength. A pause. It was about discipline under pressure. Mason remained silent. Ava stood still. Harris turned slightly toward Mason. Staff Sergeant, he said firmly, your experience is not in question. Another pause. But your control under adaptive pressure is. That sentence landed publicly. Not humiliating, but clear. Mason nodded slowly. No argument. Because there wasn't one left to make. The base fully understands now. The formation of 900 soldiers remained quiet, but awareness had changed completely. Earlier, Mason had looked dominant. Now he looked exposed. Earlier, Ava had looked quiet. Now she looked defined. Not because she changed, but because perception finally caught up to reality. One soldier whispered. She didn't even break a sweat. Another replied. That's what makes it worse. Because effortlessness often feels unfair to those who rely on force. Final moment between them. Mason finally looked at Ava properly. No anger now. No challenge. Just acknowledgement. You never rushed anything, he said quietly. Ava nodded slightly. I didn't need to. That was it. No celebration. No humiliation. Just completion of truth. Mason exhaled slowly. For the first time, he wasn't trying to win anything. He was processing. Ava walks away. Ava stepped out of the ring. Same pace as she entered. Same calm posture. Same silence. But now, no one saw her the same way anymore. Because everyone understood something simple but powerful. She wasn't reacting to pressure. She was built for it. And behind her, 900 soldiers didn't cheer. They didn't laugh. They didn't celebrate. They simply watched. Because sometimes the most impactful victories don't create noise. They create silence that lasts longer than sound.